While the Crusades won the battles in the movement, Cecil B. DeMille gave them victory. In many cases, they got hell beaten out of them. Now, because these well-dressed lords took with them common ordinary people to do their work in their laundry, these common ordinary people saw these lords with their tails being beaten, on their knees begging for mercy, and he understood that this man who owned the land and controlled his life was less than God. In the meantime, back in Europe, the young lords had given up a privilege that the old lords were hanging on to, the privilege of first night. If you lived on his land and you married, he had the privilege of spending the first night with your wife. The young lords had conceded that the poor critter should at least have that privilege. And so now, when the old lords came back into Europe, there was a semblance of human recognition for the serf or the plain white slave on the plantation. This semblance of human recognition would lead to more demand, lead to a fight against child labor, lead to, while it didn't lead to the banishment of prostitution, it would lead to workhouses and places where they could be at least put people out of sight. Europe had lost 1/3 of its population through famine and plagues. Now, on the eve of 1400 AD, this is the sight you see in Europe, far less in creature comfort than anything in Africa and in Asia. Engaged in Europe in tribal warfare that they are engaged in right now. Only in Europe you don't call it tribal warfare. You will not deal with the fact that not only what is happening in Russia is in part tribal warfare, is part of race war. You forgot the millions of Asians who went into Russia, went into Europe and didn't go home. Asian men who came without women and didn't go home to satisfy that biological necessity. Indeed, if it is a necessity all the time, well, that's another lecture, but I think we've overdone that assumption. I think what is a biological pleasure is not always a biological necessity. Let's at least concede that much. Well, anyway, these Europeans intermingle with these Asians to create a European ethnic entity that's still in Europe. But Europe was still hungry. While it was awakening, it began to pay some attention to the new light in Europe, and the only light in Europe was in the Mediterranean area, then dominated by Africans, Arabs, and Berbers. The Africans were totally in control of Spain, parts of France, and Portugal, where the African had left 1240 AD. But in 1415 AD, the Portuguese got up enough nerve to attack a small place on the coast of Africa, a place called Sintra. Now, as battles go, it wasn't much of a battle, and as places go, it wasn't much of a place. I visited the place, and some say it's about the size of Central Park, and I walked all over it. It's not as big as Central Park. But the Battle of Sutra was a turning point, because after 7/11, when an African general, Jabal Tariq bin Azad, led an army into Spain, Spain had been under the domination of Africans, Berbers, and Arabs. And Europe had lived in fear of what they referred to as the infidel Arabs in the Mediterranean. Being blocked from the trade in the Mediterranean, Europe cringed, and it is this African Berber and this Arab that drove the European into the so-called Middle Ages by destroying the markets in the Mediterranean. With the Battle of Sutra, the European had asserted himself and began to claim access to the Mediterranean. All right. 1455, arguments between the Africans and the Arabs over puritanical approaches to women had weakened the African-Arab hold on Spain and the Mediterranean. They also had puritanical religious arguments, because when the African joins a religion, he is a Puritan within that religion. Other people join a religion and use it for their best interests. But when the African joins it, he takes it in its purest form. I have said before, we will out-pope the Pope and we will out-Muhammad Muhammad. We are the true believers. Amen. We are the only people naive enough to believe in Christianity and democracy. Other people know it's not going to work. Don't play around with it. Know full well it's not going to work. All right. Now, Spain and Portugal would now approach the Pope. And the Pope would say to them, you two good Catholic nations, stop fighting among yourselves. You're both authorized to reduce to servitude all infidel people. You should read Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery. A lot of people think it's an old chestnut. Why must I read that old book? That old book, written over 40 years ago, has some of the most concise information on how and why the slave trade came, of any book that's so far been written. Brian David Bryan, a scholar at Cornell University, wrote a book called Slave and Western Civilization, 3 times larger, and said less. All right. My point here is that is a forgotten character. It had not been taken into consideration. I'm still on my way to Christopher Columbus. Prince Henry, the navigator. Prince Henry got a catch of maps, mostly made by Jewish gold dealers who have been dealing with gold in the Western Sudan and on the coast of West Africa. The Western Sudan are the nations in inner West Africa, as against the coastal nations of West Africa. Europe is beginning to see the shape of certain parts of Africa. They're no longer guessing on all of it. Now, with these maps, Prince Henry began to open up a school for chart making and map making to let the European know something about the other parts of the world. I recently appraised a book they called Prince Henry, the starter of the slave trade, which is inaccurate. But he did set European maritime skill in motion using the maritime information the Africans and the Arabs had preserved at the University of Salamanca in Spain. Europe now would go back to sea. It had previously forgotten longitude and latitude. In other words, if they put a ship out to sea, they wouldn't know which way to turn it. Didn't know east from west. That challenge from Africa, from Mediterranean Africa, that challenge of the Moors, that challenge of the Arabs, had driven Europe into the Middle Ages and had dulled the senses